All right, folks, welcome back. This is going to be the second part of our notes on chapter 31, um, the age of Reagan. I'm not even going to say it that this is going to be shorter because, I mean, come on, let's be realistic here. So, in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get right into it. All right, so first we'll look at the election of 1980. Now, we learned last time that Jimmy Carter, despite trying really hard to do good things, um, doesn't go so well. It's a classic case of someone that um, wants to do so much and ultimately does very little because he tries to do so many things. Like I said last time, um, pick a couple things and do them very well, or do a bunch of things and do most of them fairly poorly. And the American people speak very soundly in 1980 that they want change. Now, there's a lot of factors for that, and um, Carter does win a handful of states, but it is a landslide victory, a majority vote win by 8.5 million votes for a new president in 1980 by the name of Ronald Reagan. And so we go off into the inauguration of Reagan in 1981, and it represents a time of great change uh, and growth and difference for the American people. Ultimately, what I like to refer to as the eight greatest years in American history. I mean, just look at the smile on that man's face. It's near perfection. Um, a big factor, and again, we got into this last video when we talked about the Sagebrush Rebellion and you know this evangelical movement, which still exists today. You see evangelicals, white evangelical base tends to be very strong in the South and tends to generally support Republican candidates. Um, you know, on this whole ideology of what is that they have some sort of moral superiority over other groups or the left or other people. Okay, that has its roots in a lot of places. Beginning in the late 1970s, like we talked about with the Sagebrush Rebellion, we talked about with a while back last chapter with Phyllis Schlafly and what she viewed as the eroding of the American family through the feminist movement and the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s. So this is a backlash to all of that. The American people are tired of great society programs. They're tired of funding the welfare state for people. They're tired of high taxes and seemingly not getting anything back. Reagan emerges in 1980 as a candidate that promises to put us back to a time that the American people missed, a time of the 1950s, a time under Eisenhower, a time where everybody seemed happy with the progress of the country before Vietnam happens and Watergate and all these social movements that, again, in the view of many people, particularly the new American right, that our moral standing, our ideological standing has eroded. And Reagan comes in and promises to change that, and that rises him to very high levels of popularity amongst the American voting base, as you saw on the previous slide with a landslide victory in 1980. So, big win in 1980, January 21st, 1981, starts off right out of the gate. After 444 days, the hostages in Iran are released and sent back home, which Carter tried and failed to do. And, Reagan becomes president and almost immediately seemingly gets, a first great victory in we're going to bring home, we're going to bring home those folks that had, been stuck in Iran for 14 months. Uh, so here we are, off to a good start. Reagan wins. Here we go. Um, so what is it that is so appealing about Ronald Reagan? And for me, obviously, and full disclosure, I'm obviously biased towards Ronald Reagan because he was my first president, in my life that I remember. But what was so appealing about Ronald Reagan ultimately comes down to his personality. Ronald Reagan, and he did have his drawbacks as president. I hate to say, but if I'm being honest, it's true. But he was a man of high character. He told people generally, told people the truth from his perspective. He remained a positive attitude, and that's something that we hadn't had really in the presidency since Kennedy. Kennedy was encouraging to the American people. He evoked the ideology of the shining city upon the hill. And Ronald Reagan takes that and continues it himself, actually referencing, that old shining city upon a hill, John Winthrop ideal that goes back to the, 1620s and 30s. That America can be that again, that America can be everything that we dream it can be. Again, that it can be the world leader that it seems to have lost in its loss of power and prestige and things through the Iran hostage crisis and through Watergate and through Vietnam and through the financial troubles of the 1970s, brought on by Great Society programs, brought on by the war, brought on by the general cynicism and distaste for government in the wake of Watergate. Ronald Reagan gave great speeches and he joked with people and he seemed to every American like a father or grandfather figure that people had to like. He could make fun of himself. He often did that because, it was a big issue about his age. He was 69 when he was elected president, which at that time was the oldest any president had ever been elected. Obviously, that's been surpassed by both Biden and Trump. So there were a lot of concerns about his age, and he joked about that. He once said somebody made some reference about Thomas Jefferson, and Reagan said, "Oh, I knew Thomas Jefferson." Or 1984, when he ran for re-election, he ran against a guy that was only a few years younger than him, and Walter Mondale, and at one point said that after he was asked a question at a debate, said that, I refuse to exploit my opponent's youth and inexperience, which of course in the context made everybody laugh because, that guy was really old too. That would be like Trump, who's 4 years younger than Biden, but is also really old, saying the same thing, or Biden saying the same thing about Trump in a debate. So, everybody trusted Ronald Reagan and liked him. And like I said, he was a man of high moral character. And, because of the stuff that had happened, particularly Watergate, we had lost that in, our belief in government in prior years. Not that Jimmy Carter wasn't a moral guy. He actually very much was. But, a lot of people didn't like him. And so they didn't view him that way. And the same thing with Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford had no chance because people were so disenchanted because of Nixon. So that is what, largely what makes Ronald Reagan so appealing to so many people. Reagan's goal as president, from the economic perspective, is to kind of restore American prosperity. And for the first year and a half of his presidency, things aren't going very well. Unemployment gets really high. The book says it was as high as 11%. I've seen things that said it was 13, so it's somewhere between 11 and 13%, which is a really high unemployment rate. Well, I guess we'll say 12 just to be, just to split the difference there. And Reagan sees this as the result of a lot of the economic restraints that are placed on people because of taxes. Another thing Reagan famously said when he was running for president in 1980 was, you know, going against the long-held belief that government is not the solution to people's problems, but government is the problem. Reagan believed smaller government, lowering the tax burden on American people, is going to be, the solution to the economic problems that had plagued Americans since the late 1960s. Now, by the early 1980s, despite the high unemployment and still relatively high inflation, we're kind of out of the whole stagflation thing, so that's good. We're still seeing manufacturing jobs drop. Remember, we spent a lot of time on that graph on the last video. So manufacturing jobs are still dropping. That's not good. The whole energy crisis thing, that's kind of come to an end, so that's a good thing too. So Reagan sees this as a good time to apply this new, quote, air quotes, new type of economic tax cut that becomes known as supply side economics or Reaganomics. Now, a lot of people associate this solely with Ronald Reagan, but it actually happened before. A supply side tax cut, okay? And you're going to bear with me while I explain this to you. A supply side tax cut that people also refer to as, trickle down economics. So the people call trickle-down economics is basically this idea that if you lower taxes, people will have more money and will be able to spend more money. So lower taxes, people have more money, they can spend more money. Another factor of this concept is something called deregulation. Okay, now, and I'll get into this more in a second, but in regards to supply side economics, deregulation allows businesses to grow with few federal obstacles, allowing them to increase wealth and the size of their businesses, therefore creating more jobs, giving more people money to spend. Okay, with more jobs, obviously, people have more money, can purchase more goods. Ultimately, what this does is it helps the economy to grow. The downside, and I'll get into this later too, is it increases the federal deficit, and the federal government ultimately has to assume a lot of the debts created by this by kind of allowing the federal deficits to increase. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Ronald Reagan isn't the first person to do this. In fact, Warren Harding in the 1920s instituted a similar supply-side tax cut, as did JFK in the early 1960s. So it's not just a Republican thing. It is an economic policy, but it's most closely associated with Reagan. Lower taxes on businesses, on people. People have more money in their pockets, more money they will spend. They spend that money, that creates wealth, that creates jobs. It allows businesses to expand, creating more jobs, so on and so forth. Of course, it costs, especially because we're in a difficult economic situation in the early 1980s. However, at the time it happens, Reaganomics works. It works very well, and relatively quickly, beginning in late 1982, early 1983, the economy starts a massive rebound and growth that lasts throughout the rest of the decade. My formative years, therefore explaining a little bit why this man is so wonderful. Now back to deregulation. A lot of people have become disenchanted, particularly those that are part of the New American Right, with the extensive government regulation into their lives. This extends from, environmental restrictions, emissions and stuff like that, to business restrictions in terms of kind of limiting how much businesses can grow, all kinds of different areas where there's all kinds of government regulations. Reagan rolls back these regulations in a process called deregulation. The idea is, with fewer regulations, again, businesses can grow because the federal government isn't putting obstacles that prevent them from doing so. For instance, with environmental deregulation, which of course a lot of people don't like. Um, with the regulations that had been in place environmentally, companies have to cut back on employment and what can be produced and stuff like that. With deregulation, they can produce more, they can hire more, and increase their wealth, therefore increasing the size of their business, therefore creating more jobs. Okay, same general idea here. So Reagan deregulates all these industries and all these things and allows them, through the 1980s to kind of go on this kind of upward trend of growth that lasts really up until 1990. Of course, we already talked about tax cuts. This is all part of the whole supply side concept. If we cut taxes, the thing with this, right, is when you cut taxes, you really got to cut federal spending. Like right now, for instance, with all the money going into coronavirus and all the stimulus packages and stuff, if you cut taxes now, that's going to massively increase the federal debt, which we have done exponentially over the last 4 years. The federal debt has grown tremendously. Trump cut taxes a lot, but we still poured a lot of money into federal programs, defense, and those sort of things. That makes it problematic because if you cut taxes but you don't cut federal spending, you're going to find bigger federal deficits. Okay. Now, like I said, this whole supply side thing does lead to substantial economic recovery, which is really, really good, and the 80s become this boom period. But on the other side, we have these growing budget deficits. One of the things that Ronald Reagan promised to do was to shrink the federal budget. But with the tax cuts and everything else here, that proves almost too impossible a task. And during his presidency, the federal budget increases quite a bit. Now, if you remember way back in Chapter 6, Alexander Hamilton said, hey, federal deficits and debts are a good thing. It's good because it keeps money flowing in the economy, which is true. But the problem is, for us is now that we've got this $23 trillion deficit debt, that's fine until the people that we owe money to start asking for the money, right? So that's why you want to be careful about the national debt, okay? Because until, it's fine until people start asking for that money, whether it's countries, whether it's private interests, whatever. If you default on that, then, we're going to start losing stuff. But that's something that that could happen sometime soon. It could happen sometime never. Who knows? So that is a crisis. Bigger budget deficits are certainly a problem, and they grow a lot in the 1980s under Reagan. They get a little bit better in the 90s, and it got kind of progressively worse throughout the 2000s. It was bad kind of during Obama's first 4 years. Then it got a little bit better. And then since from 2016 on, that's gotten really big, especially the last year, but largely due to COVID. God bless you, Mr. President. So again, here's a look at deficits. So you'll notice, really since 1940, we've operated much more frequently with a budget deficit than a surplus. And the last time that we had any significant surplus was the last 4 years of Bill Clinton's presidency, actually, 1997. It was 98, 99, 2000, 2001 that we actually operated on budget surpluses, meaning the national debt gets smaller because we're not spending all the money that we have. Since then, 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah. Since then, obviously, they've got larger in the last 4 to 5 years. In the last 4 to 5 years, they've gotten even way bigger than that. in many cases. In fact, you can look at on my door. There's kind of a newspaper clipping of what the deficit situation looks like. So, just something to look at and understand. And we can talk about it more in class if you have questions regarding this. All right. So let's talk a little bit more about Ronald Reagan or the Reagan Revolution, Reagan's presidency, in regards to um, foreign policy objectives and things of that nature. Okay. So Ronald Reagan's role in the world wants to change it a little bit. Look, beginning with the failure in Vietnam and Watergate and just generally the blah presidency of Jimmy Carter. No disrespect to Mr. Carter. America had lost a lot of prestige. And Reagan, if one thing he does very well, is seeks to and successfully works to improve that position in the world. One thing that Ronald Reagan is someone who is very committed to Cold War objectives. Okay? And he's very much a Cold Warrior, like I said about Kennedy and Eisenhower and some of these other guys. And in 1984 or 84, they introduced this idea, the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which was called Star Wars for short, obviously, because that was the Star Wars, the first Star Wars movies were out around that time and really popular. The idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative was basically this idea to build these satellites that could basically use lasers to destroy any nuclear missiles or anything that were sent by the Soviet Union before they would ever reach the United States. Now, Star Wars or SDI would have been incredibly expensive and fairly unrealistic as a concept at that time. Probably something we could do now with newer technology, but in the early 1980s, who knows how effective it would have been. The brilliance of this was Reagan was all about this idea and promoted it and said it was a really good thing. It scared the heck out of the Soviet Union. And ultimately, it's one of the things, many things, that forces the Soviet Union, kind of to the table a little bit more to come to agreements to de-escalate the Cold War against the United States, which, helped essentially by the end of the 1980s bring about the end of the Cold War. Like I said, Reagan is a big Cold War guy. He got into politics in the height of the Cold War. He was committed to it. He was the head of the Screen Actors Guild and actively went after communists that were in Hollywood. So now, if you remember the Nixon Doctrine, where we basically kind of de-escalated our involvement with other countries in regards to containment, Reagan kind of reverses that, right? And it's really genius on his part in the realization in the 1980s, I think, that he has that the Soviet Union is weakening. The Soviet Union is overextended. The Soviet Union is in the midst of their own Vietnam and their war in Afghanistan. And Reagan seizes on this opportunity to kind of ramp up our efforts against communism. Okay, wherever anything communist seems like it may be threatening countries or places around the world, Reagan says we'll send troops there. We'll do what we can to prevent communism from growing in those places, and he does that, which makes the Soviet Union weaker and more scared. Right? If the Cold War was a 12-round fight, the first couple rounds, it's pretty even. We're going at. Then the U.S. takes the lead. You get to the 8th, 7th, 8th round. We kind of back off a little bit, and we kind of observe a little bit while the Soviet Union is teetering here and there. And we get to the 11th and 12th round, and it's Reagan, and he senses that they're done, they're weakening. It's time to go for that knockout punch. And that's essentially what Star Wars is. That's what the Reagan Doctrine is. Really wanting to pour basically anything that seems relatively communist around the world. We're going to go and try to stamp that out in places as much as we possibly can. This helps this new approach to Cold War, which has really kind of restored American prestige in the world by 1984, and this kind of coalescing of the Republican Party, which is strong at this point under Reagan, mostly because of Ronald Reagan, and not so much anybody else, but Ronald Reagan is the Republican Party in 1984, extremely popular, and that and the fact that by 1984 the economy's really doing well again. And the rhetoric that Reagan uses, things like it's morning again in America, things are good, people are happy, life is better, family values, all that good stuff, helps Reagan to get reelected in 1984 by massive margins, which I'll show you on the next slide. He wins 49 out of 50 states. It's the biggest electoral landslide in American history. Of course it is, because this is the best person that America has ever produced. Now, again, in interest of being fair and telling you historical truths, there are a few weaknesses that come about during the second term of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Two big scandals that don't directly implicate Ronald Reagan, but when you're the president and those things happen, you're always somewhat tied to it. One of the big problems that is less associated with Reagan is something called the savings and loan crisis. Now, this is a complicated thing, so I'm going to try to break it down for you as simply as possible. There's two types of banks. There's national banks, commercial banks, okay? That's like Key Bank, Chase Bank, Fifth Third Bank, places like that, okay? And then there's community banks or SNL banks, savings and loan banks. And they're based more in particular communities, and the money from these banks doesn't come from some national source. They tend to come from that bank and more local sources, and their funds tend to go to people on a more local basis. Okay, so there's a huge crisis in savings and loans in the late 1980s and early 1990s that causes a lot of these banks to actually go out of business. Now you're asking yourself, wait a minute, I thought the FDIC was supposed to prevent that. Yes-ish. Okay, banks can still fail. See, here's the thing. I want you to forget what you think you understand about banks. Banks make money not on the money that regular people, you and I, put in there for our own bank accounts. They make their money on major loans that they give out to corporations, to businesses, to development projects. That's where money is made on these banks. And if those loans get defaulted on, yes, large banks can fail. Now, large national banks probably aren't going to fail because they're large national banks and they have a lot of capital and a lot of assets. Savings and loans, by comparison, don't, because they're more localized. Okay, so a lot of these savings and loan banks in the 1980s fall into crisis because they give out a lot of what you call high-risk loans. Okay, for instance, somebody that doesn't have much collateral, in other words, doesn't have much money, wants a loan to buy a house, and they go to the national bank to do it, but the national bank says, we don't need your money or your risk, so sorry. They go to the local savings and loan community bank, and they give them the loan because they want the loan, the debt, and the capital, and the money. These banks want to make money off the interest that you'll pay on that loan for a house, right? But if it's a high-risk loan, people will, more often default on those loans. And basically, to make a long story short, a lot of these companies give, or a lot of these savings and loan banks give out a lot of high-risk mortgages, or a lot of high-risk loans to people and small businesses, and a lot of these people default on the loans or can't afford to pay them because of the interest rates. This causes a lot of these small community savings and loans banks that aren't as protected by the FDIC to fail, causing a lot of people to lose their money. or at least have bigger banks buy up those loans and repossess people's homes and stuff like that. This happens all over the place. It's a predatory practice. A lot of people get implicated for criminal activity associated with it. It's a really bad situation. It doesn't reflect particularly well on Reagan. The other big thing that doesn't reflect particularly well on Reagan is the Iran-Contra affair. Okay, so Iran, who was our big enemy, in order to help get hostages released and some of the other problems with Iran, we agreed to sell them arms, okay, guns and stuff like that, because they were in a war with Iraq. Now, if we sell a bunch of tanks to a foreign country, that money comes back to the United States and then gets basically put back into the federal budget or help to pay off a national debt or whatever that might be, right? But instead, and again, I'm trying to simplify the explanation of this from what the book tells you, but instead of that money from selling the arms to Iran, instead, we take that money and give it to Nicaragua. So a group of freedom fighters in Nicaragua known as the Contras could fight against the anti-American, pro-ish communist Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. That's a big no-no. That's illegal. That money isn't supposed to be funneled there without congressional approval or without, basically the approval of the people, because that's not what's supposed to happen with the money. So again, to explain again, the Iran-Contra affair happens because we sell arms to Iran, but instead of that money coming back to America, it goes to Nicaragua to fund the Contras in their fight against the Sandinistas, again, which was a kind of pro-ish communist anti-American group. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and we'll move on from there. We're almost done, I promise. The biggest success of the presidency of Ronald Reagan probably is ultimately the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, which mostly happens because of Reagan, but actually doesn't happen till Daddy Bush, till George H.W. Bush is president. This happens in large part because Reagan is a great diplomat and works well with the new Soviet premier, the new leader of the Soviet Union, a guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev, when he comes to power in 1985, promotes this idea of what he calls glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost is openness, perestroika is reform. So he promises to promote these ideas of openness and reform in the Soviet Union because he realizes, as Reagan does, that the Soviet Union is fading. They don't have money. They're losing control of like the Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe. The whole thing in Afghanistan is a fiasco and a disaster. Reagan seizes on this opportunity to really put the screws to and a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. And this ultimately will result in 1991 in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the total collapse of the Soviet Union. They're not communist anymore as of 1991. And there you have it. We win the Cold War. Thank you, Mr. President. Again, here's a look at 1984. Overwhelmingly, the American people say we like Ronald Reagan. He probably would have won all 50 states. If Walter Mondale didn't come from Minnesota, you got to at least give him his home state. And, Republicans never win in Washington, D.C. So the biggest electoral landslide ever, Reagan got like 60+% of the vote and wins the Electoral College 525-13. Really, really sorry that one went even longer than I thought it would, but it's Ronald Reagan, so I don't care that much. We'll see how much shorter the next one is. It will be shorter. See you later.